Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. When we last left off, Blizzard had just celebrated World of Warcraft's 5th anniversary with the release of a revamped Onyxia. And just before that, Blizzard had given players a glimpse of both patch 3.3 and of the Cataclysm. So they had something to be excited about, both in the long term and the short term. All news was positive, and with World of Warcraft soon hitting its peak subscriber count, the game really did seem unstoppable. Yet, as positive as all this would seem, the path forward would be a very rough one. In patch 3.3, Blizzard were about to strike gold, but the fallout of that success would define the game's direction for years to come. 3.3 was a massive patch in almost every way, but with one exception: world content. At this stage, patches just did not fit the modern template, really with Blizzard focusing more on what the game needed in the short term. PvE content that was instanced was absolutely the focus of this patch, with it being the largest yet in that regard, with 3 dungeons and a massive new raid. 3.3 did bring a lot more than content though, introducing the very controversial looking for dungeon system, which undeniably changed the social experience by streamlining out much of how traditional group formation would work. The dungeons of Wrath of the Lich King were easier than ever because of all of the new gear that players had, and this ease was very suited to the random matchmaking system of LFD, leading to many players just chain running them for tokens. Now, while that may sound like a good thing, the downsides were certainly not lost on people at the time. A backlash, while not uniform across the community, was actually very strong. Players were worried about the social bonds of the game breaking down, and I can't say they were wrong. LFD really did streamline away quite a lot. And as much as the convenience was nice, it did also remove some of the incentives that would drive guild formation, which even back then was something that just about everybody knew was a key factor in the game's success. More than anything, I think what it really did is it increased the perception that the end game of WoW could be played solo. Now, putting those more academic worries to the side, the system pretty much did work as intended for most dungeons, but echoing the future of this system, the more difficult 3 new dungeons would be more troublesome. Yes, dungeons. This patch actually brought 3 new dungeons: the Forge of Souls, the Pit of Sauron, and the Halls of Reflection, with the latter being particularly challenging. Now, these were all harder than the past dungeons, meaning that even though they did have their own LFD queue, they were still comparatively quite hard and they had higher failure rates. Now, while they were not as hard as TBC heroics with launch gear, they were no joke, and that is a part of what made them so memorable. After playing so many of Wrath of the Lich King's 5-player dungeons, which were really quite easy, the ICC ones were a very welcome change in pace, bringing some of the best content that this expansion would see, at least for the 5-player people. Now, they also slotted quite well into the pre-raid progression, and importantly, they felt like really good raid training. Their bosses actually had some memorable mechanics that you really would need to pay attention to. So overall, these 3 dungeons were probably the best trio or the best lump of dungeon content, other than with an expansion release, that we had got yet. It was really fantastic, and I think they hold up today. Narratively, they also helped to give a bit more background to Jaina, Sylvanas, and the Lich King, with storytelling that honestly is a lot more akin to what we see in a modern raid. There was one final bonus to these dungeons: Bellular. So trash in the dungeons could drop a battered hilt. Now, you could either sell that on the auction house for a large amount of money, or you could follow its questline, getting you a epic sword. Now, while this was not a groundbreaking thing, it was actually a really nice addition to those dungeons that sort of spiced up the economy a bit. Then for the more casual players, Blizzard decided to add a new weekly quest, which was to go and kill a raid boss from one of the expansion's past raids. Now, this really was a wonderful idea. It kept the content of those raids somewhat relevant, and it really varied the player's experience. Plus, it also guided newer players into raid content. This, on top of the already accessible raids like Sartharion, Onyxia, and the Vault of Archivon, really produced an expansion with a lot of gateway raid content, and that allowed many players like myself to transition from being casuals to being progression raiders. As for Icecrown Citadel itself, the new raid of this patch, well, once again, they nailed the content, but that just is not the full story. In keeping with this expansion's experimental nature, ICC introduced a number of bizarre new systems. Icecrown Citadel was a 4-wing raid, with the first section of 4 bosses leading players into a more open section of the raid, where they could choose between going to the Plague Works, the Crimson Halls, and the Frostwing Halls. But not initially, because Icecrown Citadel was, and I think still is, the most time-gated instance in the game's history. Bar and Crash, but it was a different kettle of fish. The first wing opened up on the 8th of December 2009. Then the 3-boss Plague Wing opened up on the 5th of January, with the 2-boss Crimson Halls opening up on the 19th of January, and the Frostwing Halls and Lich King opening on the 2nd of February, for a total of just under 3 months of time gating. I mean, that's actually a bit more hardcore than modern LFR, but there was also another key difference. The end bosses of each wing were extra hard, meaning that the difficulty curve wasn't really linear. It would be common to have all of the non-end bosses of the wings cleared, but to say still be progressing on Putricide. Now this was reflected in the heroic mode attempt system, which was only active on the end wing bosses, and it would give you 5 attempts per week on those bosses initially, with additional attempts unlocking to you as the wings opened up. And then to make things even more strange, Blizzard implemented a creeping content nerf that kicked in a month after the raid was fully unlocked. It initially started off at a 5% health and damage buff, but that would eventually rise up to 30% by July. Yeah, a massive nerf that came on top of the natural increase in player power as people got more gear week after week. I thought it was a bad idea at the time, and I still think it was a bad idea now. Now, these problems were a little bit frustrating, but they overall for me didn't take away from the quality of the raid. Icecrown Citadel had a wide range of fights, all with a pretty different tone and feel. The non-linear structure meant that once the wings were opened up, teams would have a lot of freedom in where they would actually go. And while, say, Valrithria was a bit of a dud, I would say, and the gunship was just some free loot, on the whole I'd say that it had an extremely strong lineup of bosses, with the Lich King being a particularly strong and memorable fight, at least for the time. While, say, the likes of Lich are almost definitely better fights, Lich King was very engaging and very memorable for the day, with mechanics like Defile and Valkyr really spooking players quite a lot, and of course, it was all with a wonderful backdrop. Of course, it would not be a raid without a race to world first, and this really was one that was complicated by the oddities of the raid unlock. So Lich King 25 died shortly after its release, but the limited attempt system meant that it would take 46 days for the 25 heroic version to fall. Now, Paragon's world first 25 heroic, that was just a massive moment for the game. You've got to remember, WoW was at its peak. It was well known on all of the internet, meaning that it really did get broad attention, not just from the WoW community. But of course, Lich King was not without its controversy. While the 25 heroic world first was pretty much drama-free, the same cannot be said for the first Lich King 25 normal kill. So what happened is that Insidia discovered that Saronite bombs, which were a part of the rogue rotation of the time, would actually bug out the encounter, making it easier. Now, instead of stopping or changing their strategy, they instead used this to their advantage, getting their short-lived world-first achievement that was then soon stripped by Blizzard, with the players receiving 72-hour bans. So, that was the race. Overall, Icecrown Citadel was an excellent raid. Yes, it was marred by a few questionable decisions, but as a piece of content, it would prove its quality over time and would be instrumental in creating new raiders out of their, I'd say, the game's more casual to, like, mid-tier players. And to really get into that, I think we need to talk about the difficulty levels of this raid and how they were designed. So at this stage, 10 and 25 were not just raid sizes. 10 was easier than 25 and dropped lower item level gear, and then both of them had hard modes. This essentially meant that you did have 4 effective difficulty modes, but what really worked for the game's favor was the puggability of the easier ones. The first wing of Icecrown Citadel was very puggable, with the further wings becoming more puggable over time. Now this, in combination with the other puggable raids like, say, Onyxia and Sarth and VOA, and the weekly raid quest, meant that more than ever, players were actually self-organizing into ad hoc raid teams, and that greatly expanded the gameplay of World of Warcraft for many players. I'd say this is the largest success of Wrath of the Lich King, and as we'll soon find out, Blizzard's, I would say, complete misunderstanding of how to deal with this over the next 5 years really just defined much of the future of the game. Now, Icecrown had other memorable mechanics. It had a raid reputation. You would gain rep with the Ashen Verdict as you killed bosses. Then as you climbed the rep ranks, you would upgrade an epic ring to get better and better. It was a really nice bit of side progression that happened on top of the various currencies, which meant that even if you didn't get something from a boss kill, you would at least get something. ICC also then had bonus quests that would spawn into parts parts of the raid, such as, say, killing a mini-boss, and that would get you a bag of loot. And then there was, of course, Shadowmourne, which was another really long questline and a lot of content for a guild to do, plus the Saronite bars, which were really vibrant for the economy. All these things added to the longevity of the raid, and they made it more than just a collection of bosses. So on the whole, this was an excellent patch. It brought in amazing content, and while there were some questionable decisions, World of Warcraft subscriber numbers would hold through the ensuing content drought. Well, okay, Blizzard added Hellion. It was a nice gesture that eased us into the Cataclysm, gave us a bit of lore, kind of showed us the theme, but it wasn't really that notable in the grand scheme of things. Cataclysm would release a year after the final patch of Wrath of the Lich King, with the game actually holding its massive subscriber count throughout. And I think that really does show the incredible longevity of the Wrath of the Lich King model and how it expanded the scope of the game for so many people. As I've said many times though, the spectre of Wrath of the Lich King would haunt Blizzard for years to come. So yes, it is time to talk about the legacy of Wrath of the Lich King. So it's really clear to me that while Wrath had a rocky launch, it eventually ended up striking a balance between the casuals and the hardcores. Hard mode let Blizzard create some of their hardest and best quality content ever, and it opened up the room for a more reasonable normal mode, all while having smaller gateway raids to get the casuals involved. Today, those smaller raids have been replaced mostly with world bosses, which don't really resemble a raid environment that much. Modern day world bosses in LFR, they just are not as good a gateway drug to, into raiding as, say, ICC 10 was back in Wrath. Now, all of this was particularly possible because of the puggable nature of 10-player mode, and really that's where the future problems would arise. So, just like Wrath of the Lich King, Cataclysm had 10 and 25-player raids with a hard mode, but there was a very essential change. 10 and 25 were of equal challenge, making 10 far harder and less pub-friendly, no longer really suiting the friends and family guilds that were basically catered to so well by ICC 10. Now, in doing that, they essentially removed the most popular gameplay mode from the game, leaving many players in limbo until the return of this difficulty mode through patch 5.4's flexible raid difficulty. Now, Flex is a fantastic system, but the problem is its interim system, 2011's LFR. Ghostcrawler would later go on to talk about his LFR regrets, and I think it's safe to say that if Flex had have been introduced in patch 4.3 instead of LFR, I think the game would have actually had an easier time retaining players. We have now actually found ourselves, though, in a position where the raid structure does closely resemble the ICC days in terms of difficulty, with normal being the equivalent of 5.4's flex, but with a reward problem. So let's talk about rewards. Now, the endgame of Wrath spanned item level 200 to 271. While Battle for Azeroth spans from 355 of Uldir Normal to like 415 of Dazar'alor Mythic, and of course the third raid and the fourth raid are going to bump that up significantly as well. We then have a lot of item level bloat, and we have so many catch-up systems that really catch-up is the main mode of gearing, even for many heroic raiders. Now, this has really cut off the importance of the gateway difficulties of raid content, and really what should be the most popular high-quality content in the game. Wrath showed us the effectiveness of the currency systems and of the lower-level raid difficulties. I would say that Blizzard, they went hard against that in favor of Titan Forging, but with Battle for Azeroth bringing in things like, say, Titan Residuum, a shift in direction could be possible, even though it really does look like the randomness is firmly staying with the game. Now, moving on to dungeons, Wrath was quite something. The initial launch ones were just too easy, eventually being about right for a random matchmaking system like LFD, but of course, the cracks in LFD would show with the Halls of Reflection failure rates. Blizzard didn't really learn from this, and when Cataclysm came out, they actually released some of their greatest dungeons ever, some of my favorite content ever actually, but with a difficulty that did not mesh with the LFD system. This led to a launch disaster that necessitated the nerfing of those dungeons, which then really led to them feeling like shades of their former selves. Blizzard did, however, learn that the addition of new dungeons was exciting. ICC proved that with its 3 dungeons really acting as their own mini tier of progression. Players loved it. While Cataclysm tried to replicate the success of the ICC trio in patch 4.3, and it kind of failed with them misjudging their workload, having to cut a lot of content, and really just releasing a very messy final tier of content with Dragon Soul. Now this is something that would lead to them just not seeing the point in creating post-launch dungeons, and indeed we would go on to see that neither Mists of Pandaria or Warlords of Draenor would have them. Thankfully, Legion, with its revamped Mythic Plus difficulty, was able to get post-launch dungeons right. I suppose it's just sad that it took so long to make that happen. Moving on, Wrath also marked a massive change in class design direction, with the bring the player, not the class mantra really being the motto of the day. Now, the idea was to make each class a bit more robust, so the players wouldn't be benched purely based on what they played. And you know what, doing some of that was probably sensible based on the Burning Crusade. Now, this trend continued on into Cataclysm and eventually led to Mists of Pandaria, which by many modern players is considered a peak of class design. At the very least, it's when the classes were likely at their most complex, with everyone having a pretty damn massive toolkit. Blizzard have since changed their direction, now wanting each class and spec to have a bit more uniqueness, which, yes, for them often means having stronger strengths, but weaker weaknesses, and less utility. They'll never take us back to, say, the TBC or Wrath days, but they do seem to be trying to work out a sweet spot between every class being unique, and then, of course, the bring the player, not the class design goal that was introduced with Wrath of the Lich King. Then Wrath was really the end of an era in terms of the narrative. With both Illidan and Arthas gone, Blizzard had blown through their major Warcraft 3 characters, and that really led to a new era of WoW telling its own stories, with, as an example, Garrosh growing from TBC through Wrath and through Cataclysm into being the end boss of Mists of Pandaria. It really was the end of World of Warcraft's life as an expansion to the Warcraft 3 universe, with the post-Cataclysm expansions especially carving their own path forward and being their own thing. So to round it up, for me, I really think Wrath got so much right, especially on its eventual raid balance, and that's pretty much evidenced by, right now, we're pretty much back to having a very similar difficulty spread. Narratively, it was also fantastic. I think it was one of Blizzard's best worlds, at least for its time. Northrend was remarkably cohesive and immersive, and even though its inspirations are fairly clear, for whatever reason, it just felt more inspired than a lot of future areas, and I really feel like Legion actually felt like less innovative than Wrath did in terms of just the direction of the zones, bar, of course, Suramar, which was pretty damn impressive. Now, the progression of Wrath was also quite great. Personally, I liked its gear system more than the one that we have today. Even though earning the gear was quick relative to the past, it being static and directly earnable combined with having, only some slots being available for badges meant that you could get some catch-up gear quickly enough, but if you wanted, say, a new weapon or, some specific slots, you really would have to go into the raid, and that's just what you had to do. And that really did put a lot of people into raiding, which I think was good for the health of the game. So yeah, really for me, that is Wrath of the Lich King. It's a much-loved expansion that underwent massive changes throughout the course of its life. It has defined much of the modern direction of World of Warcraft, and it set Blizzard off on a path of indecision and overcompensation that led to almost half a decade of World of Warcraft, I think, having a rather muddled design direction. Even though much would be learned and innovated on during that period, eventually leading us to, say, Legion, which struck a very, very good balance indeed. Wrath of the Lich King just marks a move away from the old-school design of vanilla and TBC with a modernization and an attempt to broaden the audience of the game. Yet it seems like the indecision that followed doing those things led to it losing much of the audience that it gained with great things like ICC 10. It's interesting, World of Warcraft is a game with such a long and storied history with both wins and losses, and given what is to follow and how the roots of many of those struggles would form during Wrath, I think this series was almost always going to be destined for a bittersweet ending. There's a lot to reflect upon with Wrath, but there's also a lot to love as well. So really, that's my thoughts on Wrath of the Lich King, and that is the end of this series. More will come. I love documenting the game. I have a new series planned for that you'll see rolling out over the coming months. So thank you very much for your support of this series. Thank you for your support of this channel. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.